If any mind has some wisdom to offer in it, maybe it's yours.
Your books have sold over 45 million copies.
Historian, philosopher, and the best-selling author of *Sapiens*. Please welcome Yuval Noah Harari.
What are humans for?
As far as we know, for nothing. Human rights, just like God and heaven, are just a story that we've invented. They are not an objective reality. They are not some biological fact about Homo sapiens. There is no great cosmic drama that we have a role to play in it.
Dr. Marc Gafni, we're here because I was listening to some of the things that Yuval Noah Harari was saying in his speeches, was writing in his books, and it had a chilling effect on my body. It felt like, well, in some regard, he's making a lot of sense, but some of the things he's saying about life not having meaning, everything being a contrivance, a fiction, a story, it didn't feel quite right. And then we started talking and you said, no, actually, it's not quite right. And you started to lay it out. And so what we're doing here today is we're going through what he's actually saying and then your actual response to that, which has been a truly revivifying experience for me where I feel like, I can breathe again.
Totally. Well, first, I just love when you say revivifying. I feel revivified and I feel perspicacious, indefatigable, and just enchanted. So it's so good to see you, man.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And we have laid it out here, right, a little bit. And I just want to say, there's rare conversations where you're saying like, wow, this really matters to get this right. And I really want to get this right. And I want to get it right for two reasons. One, because as you say, Brother Yuval is doing a heroic effort out there, and I want to praise him for getting a bunch of books out with a lot of important insights about technology that are valuable and important. But that chilling effect that you describe is real. I've spoken to many more than one person who said, yeah, I kind of had faith in possibility and in life. And I'm not talking about faith in some fucked up dogma. I'm talking about faith in life and in the goodness of life and in there being what I would call a field of value. And then I read Harari and I just got massively depressed. Right? I got sad. Right? So of course Yuval would say, well, I liberated them from their old, fictional beliefs. I liberated them from some, modern expression in their bodies of medieval dogmas. But that's not quite right. Actually, we should believe in the goodness of life. We should believe that we live in a field of value. We should believe that which unites us intrinsically, the value in which we all participate, is so much greater than that which divides us. So I think it's really, really important to really take Yuval on here. In the Talmud, there's a very beautiful description in which when you have a conversation, you take your sword out, you're fiercely contesting. When someone looks in from the outside, they would think you're bitter enemies. And then you see those same two warriors walking out of the study hall, arm in arm, embraced. And so that's the model. So like, Yuval, man, love you mad. We're good, right? And let's have a real conversation and let's put it on the table. And maybe even we can start a book club. So, this is the book that, as you know, right, you started the World Philosophy and Religion Press, and myself and Zach Stein and Ken Wilber, we kind of assumed this semi-fictional persona named David J. Temple, because at key moments in culture, you have authorship that's more than one person. Right? There's a book that you and I have studied, and Yuval, you're familiar with, called the Zohar, the Book of Radiance in the 13th century. It was written by Shimon Bar Yochai, but Shimon Bar Yochai is like David J. Temple. Right? He's a collective authorship, the Vedas, the Sutras, the Bible, right? Perhaps Shakespeare, right? So we have a sense of, and at key moments in history, we need to move beyond individual authorship and do something larger. So Yuval, man, here's the deal. We're going to drink a little wine if you're up for it, and let's have a book club. So just to be clear, right? You got to pay your adversary a compliment by taking them seriously. So I read that one cover to cover. You could have made it a little shorter. Okay, now here's Sapiens, right? You got this. That's like a lot of notes on that one. Okay, there's that one. All right, now then there's Homo Deus. We kind of, hold on one second. We marked that one up. You see, we marked that one up. Okay, Homo Deus. Okay, you did good on that one. 21 questions I don't have here, but we did that one. We'll talk about it. And then, of course, man, we got to talk about these children's books. I mean, what are you doing? We're gonna talk about these children's books. You got 2 of them out so far. Nice covers, by the way. Covers are nice. Okay, but the book kind of sucks. Okay, so we got to talk about that. It sucks because it's so bad for children. I think it's like literally interrupts the chain of transmission between generations in the most fundamental way possible. But the covers are awesome. So I don't mean to be harsh, and I'm being a little light, but super crazy serious. Let's have this conversation, and I want to invite you, right, to do a little reading yourself. Okay, now I was much nicer than you. I wrote a shorter book. Okay, and I apologize in advance for anything that seems like invective. I don't think we're both right, to be clear. I think I'm completely right and you're completely wrong. So I just want to kind of make that clear. So this is not kind of multiple perspectives kind of thing, right? But you're wrong about the things that I want to talk about. And I don't mean that from a dogmatic perspective. I think you're making claims that I don't think you actually believe. And Yuval, you're lying with intention. So when I say Yuval's lying with intention, I think Yuval pretty much says that himself. Okay, so if you open Nexus, which is the new book, the name of the section, page 34, is The Noble Lie. We should not conclude that all politicians are necessarily liars or that all national histories are deceptions. So what Yuval's saying is that basically all stories, and we'll get to this later, are fictional stories, but that doesn't mean that all politicians are liars, even though they're telling fictional stories. So how are we going to pull that off? So stories are fiction, but the politicians aren't liars. How do we pull that off? So we've got a new definition of lying, which is not bad. I agree with the definition, but it is lying. So here's what Yuval says. The choice isn't simply between telling the truth and lying. There's a third option. Telling a fictional story is lying only when you pretend that the story is a true representation of reality. But telling a fictional story isn't lying when you avoid such pretense and acknowledge that you're trying to create a new intersubjective reality, meaning new fictional story, rather than represent a pre-existing objective reality, that is to say, tell the truth. What Yuval is saying here, there are no true stories which are large organizing stories. They're all fiction. And we're at this place of great existential risk, so we need to tell some story, so we're going to tell you a fictional story. Now, when there's no true stories to tell, and you decide to lie intentionally, and you're going to tell everybody a fictional story, so what you're doing is you're literally crazy making, right? Meaning, if there are true stories, if you're wrong, and you're telling people a fictional story, you're basically disintermediating between them and reality. You're actually cutting them off from the very ground of reality, and you're arrogating to yourself the right to tell that story. Now, that's got a name. That's called totalitarianism. Okay, now, Yuval, brother, I get it. There's 2 kinds of totalitarianism. Maybe 3, and you talk about all 3 just in passing sentences. So one is Orwellian totalitarianism. And Orwellian totalitarianism is based on one move. What's the move? We both know what it is. You quote Orwell twice. You quote him in Sapiens, I think in the chapter on happiness, and you quote him in the prologue of Nexus on page X14. Okay? And, Orwell basically says there's no true stories. The state controls the story, right? And therefore, who opposes the state? Winston and Julia, because they're living a love story and they think their love story is true. So the state has to crush their love story because the state has to own the power of the fictional story. And quite amazingly, you cite Orwell, right, as evidence of everything being a fictional story. In a kind of passing line, you quote Orwell where he says something like, strength is ignorance. You cite it approvingly, and then 7 or 8 lines later at the end of the paragraph on the top of the next page, you kind of say, oh, we got to not do that. But actually, if you read the paragraph carefully, you're playing a little Orwellian doublespeak, and in your book, you refer to Orwellian doublespeak. You're deeply aware of it. So let me just give you one more example. Take something like free will. Free will is a good example. So in Homo Deus, let's say page what? Let's go find it, okay? It's in your chapter on the time bomb in the laboratory. He's got a chapter on the time bomb in the laboratory, which is about free will, okay? And it's a very, very well-written chapter, which is filled with so many disingenuous statements you don't even know where to start. Like you're saying an organism is an algorithm, right? And you're claiming that as the authority of science? Really? Did you ever read Damasio, for example, who wrote an entire essay blasting the idea that an organism is an algorithm? Did you ever read Stuart Kauffman? Stuart Kauffman's entire career, one of the best kind of complexity theorists, molecular biologist, evolutionary biologist, has written 10 brilliant books, just devastating beyond any reasonable doubt the notion that an organism is an algorithm. And then you write with this kind of crazy audacity. You quote science. Science says, right? Science has decided an organism is an algorithm. No fucking way. And that's against the leading edges of everything happening in science. And I would start with Kauffman, go to Damasio, and then we can start to talk. Let's get to the major point. Are you up for reading something for us?
I'm up for reading something.
Okay. Paragraph 3. To the best of our understanding.
To the best of our scientific understanding, determinism and randomness have divided the entire cake between them, leaving not even a crumb for freedom. The sacred word freedom turns out to be just like soul, a hollow term empty of any discernible meaning. Free will exists only in the imaginary stories we humans have invented.
Right, like, hello. So we're going to get to imaginary stories. But first, it's pretty clear freedom doesn't exist. And you're not just saying freedom doesn't exist, you're claiming the authority of science for this position. That's a big claim. Now, just in case we think this was like slip of the pen, so just article in The Guardian, right, which you wrote. You've written a bunch of articles in The Guardian, right? And you're a good writer, man, by the way. You're an awesome writer, by the way. And from what I understand, from some friends who took your course, students of mine, you're an awesome raconteur. And so here we go. So the name of the article is Yuval Noah Harari, The Myth of Freedom, The Guardian. So let's be clear, this is not an esoteric position. This is what you're teaching. And the basic line is, unfortunately, free will isn't a scientific reality, right? It's a made-up story. It's a myth inherited. Okay, so that's good. I got that. Fair. You're making a claim. Overreaching claim, claiming the authority of science, certainly not a claim that I would in any way subscribe to and can bring an enormous amount of evidence against, but that's not our conversation. We're not
Well, at least if he's mad at you, then,
right.
He didn't have a choice.
Right, fair, no choice. Right, no choice. But here's the deal. You don't believe that, or you're lying to us. So let's take Nexus. You and I both know, my friend, that I can take from this book, right, 10, 20, 30 passages that all say quite clearly it's all about choosing, right? We have the ability to choose. And, Itzik, your husband, Itzik, if you're watching, don't get mad at me, man. I know you're protective of your man, so please, okay? We're going to be friends, I hope, maybe, okay? So when you guys did the back cover, you say, Nexus is the thrilling account of how we arrived at this moment and the urgent choices we must now make to survive. How the fuck are we making choices? There's no free will, man. Right? And throughout this book, there's at least, as we both know, at least 10 major passages in the book which actually are premised on free will. So that's one. Two, do you remember that article you wrote? You wrote a bunch of them, right, in The Guardian when the Ukraine-Russia thing started. So you wrote this really beautiful article, which I was truly moved to tears by. I thought it was beautiful. And no, I am not being sarcastic. I'm being serious. I know you don't like me by now, but I'm completely serious. It was a truly beautiful article. And you basically said, what it means to be a human being is that we can choose. That we've made war for so many years. We can choose against war. We need to be in the century in which we're beyond war, because that's what it means to choose. That was gorgeous, but you were lying. Because you just wrote, there is no freedom. Hello. Right? So one of two things. Either you think we're idiots, A, possibility 1. Well, let's give it 3. Possibility 2, we don't read a lot. That's not a bad one, right? Who's going to read all this shit? But possibility 3 is you're doing Orwellian doublespeak, man. And that I'm a little worried about, right? This is Orwellian doublespeak. Is there free will? Is there not free will? You're telling us both things out of both sides of your mouth. Now, if you're confused or you think there's a paradox in free will, that's a fair thing to say. Free will is paradoxical. And brother, I totally agree with you that we need to assume no free will, meaning we need to assume, okay, this is controlling me and that's controlling me and that's controlling me. So we shouldn't have a blithe assumption of free will. We should say, wow, what are all those socioeconomic choices controlling me? And then after we've taken all of that into account, so we're awake and alive, then we say, and after all of that, there's an interior place in the human being which remains, that chooses. You know, in the interior sciences, they call that nikudata bechira, the point of choice. So the interior sciences don't have a naive caricature of free will as you present it, brother, all the time, right? What Yuval's presenting in terms of the interior sciences and free will is just not true. The interior sciences basically say, and there's one master named Dessler who writes extensively on choice. He says, assume you're being controlled. Your mom's controlling you, your early trauma's controlling you, society's controlling you. Except if you just blithely assume this faith in free will, you won't realize everything that's controlling you. So take all the control into account and then know there's a point of choice.
There's one thing that arises in me that has always been important to me in this free will argument. And
Yes.
that is, you said there's a point inside the human being, which is the point of choice. And I would challenge that to say, potentially when you're looking at the mechanics of the brain and actually looking at the flesh itself, you may not be able to find that choice point. You may not be able to locate, you may not be able to poke it with a needle or a pin and say, there it is. But actually it's in the larger self, which includes our consciousness, which includes and transcends the body. So that point of choice may actually be a place that scientists can't put a stick and touch.
It's absolutely true that from a materialist perspective, if the world is empty of spirit, if the world is empty of eros, if the world is empty of, right, a livingness, if we live in an inert and dead universe which is purely material, then clearly the only thing that is causative is yesterday, right? So antecedent causation therefore dominates reality. But if we live in a world that has interiors and exteriors, if we give any reality to interiors at all, right, then the notion of freedom is actually an interior, and it also shows up in particular interesting ways in the actual world of physical causation, which is a broader conversation. Okay? And I apologize for calling you a liar, which I am, but you acknowledge that lying is cool. So in particular circumstances, so I just want to point out that you're doing that a lot, man. And it might be getting to be a habit. So I want to just give you one other example. And this one's also kind of a big deal. So one of your, and by the way, Nexus, I hope I'm helping book sales, although you don't really need me to help book sales. By the way, you're doing fucking awesome in book sales, right? Like 50 million books. But that's also why we have to take it seriously, because it has such a chilling effect. And maybe, Obs, before we look at this last lie, it's worth saying one more thing. When we said this not about Yuval, right, what we meant is, and Yuval, at Hebrew, do you remember Chaim Soloveitchik? Chaim Soloveitchik was a medieval studies scholar. So he has that idea, Aubrey, that we've talked about what he calls uncontaminated material. And uncontaminated material means someone who naively, even though they can be quite intelligent and conscious and wonderful, which Yuval, I'm taking as a given that you are, but nonetheless naively swallows the zeitgeist, right? They swallow the assumptions of the zeitgeist. So Yuval's not a philosopher, so he's swallowing the assumptions of the zeitgeist about materialism, right? About the way the world operates, right? He's taking those as a given, and in an uncontaminated way, right, he's not pulling the punch. So he's actually going to, and I admire that, and Yuval, maybe that's, our shared Israeliness, right, which is he just says, well, actually, let me just be clear, there's no meaning in the world. Actually, right, and he goes through a list of actuallys that other people pull the punch on. But it's a swallowing of the zeitgeist. Now, if Yuval was just doing that by himself, he was a popular historian who swallowed the zeitgeist and sold 50 million copies, it might be worth addressing because it's a chilling effect on the zeitgeist, but I still wouldn't have addressed it. But actually what's happening is that this set of books is actually aligning around it the legacy institutions all over the world. So we got Bill Gates saying, yay, go. We got Barack Obama saying, go, man, this is it, right? We got this, right? We got Jeff Bezos who shows up for an interview and he's got, sapiens behind him. And I could go through a list of who's who are reading the book superficially, number one. That's my charitable interpretation. Or they're reading the book seriously because they're quite smart. Barack's a smart dude. And they actually believe this. That's the more likely interpretation, meaning this book is a naive representation, but an accurate one, of the contemporary postmodern zeitgeist. And actually, what these books are saying are actually the core orienting frameworks for the World Economic Forum, for the Gates Foundation, for the Democratic Party perhaps, for parts of the Republican Party, for key parties all over Europe and Asia, right? Actually, even parts of Russia and China, right? There's this postmodern agreement that moves through the world, which is value's not real. There's no real meaning in the world. It's all made up by human beings. And it's not because these are all blithering idiots. Obviously, that's not the case. There's a lot of smart guys. It's because the Western Academy came to a standstill and at a certain point said, oh, value's not real. That became the given assumption. And from that point, that got swallowed hook, line, and sinker. And I want to just, if I can, brother, just so we can kind of establish this, I want to just cite just one text for just 10 seconds because you really kind of get, where this all comes from. And this is a text of Bertrand Russell, who, as we both know, was, kind of one of the great mathematicians, right, of the 20th century. And Russell, Yuval, as we both know, was a kind of profound atheist. And he summed up the zeitgeist. Now, everything I'm about to read is half wrong and not valid on multiple grounds. But this was, in the mid-20th century, this was the zeitgeist. This is what Yuval's swallowing hook, line, and sinker. And I want to just cite one other Russell quote afterwards just to see the problem with it. That man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, meaning a blind universe. That was man's origin. His growth and his hopes and fears, his loves and beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collisions of atoms. That no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, meaning it's all over at death. That's a dogmatic assumption, Yuval, that you repeat 6, 7, 8 times. That all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are all destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. That's the myth of heat death, which there's an enormous amount of challenges to. Right? And that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only in the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be built. Right? So that's Russell. Okay, that's Russell. And that was the dogmatic assumption 50, 70 years ago that everyone takes as a given. Okay? But I want to just do one more piece, okay? So I want to just bring one more Russell quote that's a little less known. Okay, it's Bertrand Russell. Here's quote 2, and this is where it just runs amok. And clearly Russell realizes he ran into trouble, really big trouble, which explodes the whole thing. And everyone forgot about this, which is, Russell writes, I cannot see how to refute the arguments for the subjectivity of value, of ethical value. So he says, all right, so he gets that there's, in value theory, they ran into a wall, and we're going to talk about that. But he says, but I find myself incapable of believing that all that's wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. It's an incredible sentence. I find myself incapable of believing that all that's wrong with wanton cruelty is I don't like it. In other words, what Russell's saying is, yes, after all of my materialism, I actually want to say that evil's evil. And wanton cruelty is wrong. And it's not just wrong because it's a social contrivance, says Russell. I said, I find myself incapable of believing that wanton cruelty is wrong just because it's a social contrivance. Meaning without value, I can't see anything wrong with wanton cruelty. And that's one of the first ways that we know there's something wrong with this story. We actually know that between 1945 and 1947, when Hindus and Muslims on the border of India and Pakistan bashed babies' heads against walls, and 3 million people were killed, that wasn't a social contrivance issue. Right? That wasn't, oh, that's a little weird socially. No, that was fucking evil. That was horrible. Yes, we understand how it happened. We understand the antecedent causes. But bashing babies' heads against walls is a violation of the field of value of cosmos. And Russell says, right, I find myself incapable of believing everything that I've proclaimed, which is that all that's wrong with that wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. But without a field of value, Yuval, there's no way of saying anything else. Huh. This one, Yuval, and again, this I truly mean gently, right? I don't see how this works in the noble lie, right? In other words, this one is a kind of takedown of religion, which deserves some taking down. We both agree on that. You know, Voltaire wasn't wrong when he said in Modernity, remember the cruelties, as he led the charge of modernity. So we all understand the fundamental critique of pre-modern religion and pre-modern religion in all of its modern forms that appear around the globe. So we got lots of pre-modern religion, you know, in 2024, 2030, you know, 2050. But one of the core themes in Yuval's book is that science has a self-correcting mechanism which gets its truth, and religion doesn't. That religion is pure dogma, science has no dogma. So let's talk about the science part a little later, but let's just go to the religion part now. So we all get that religions have dogmas, and that those dogmas need to be exploded, all right, for sure. And, you know, we all know that, you know, in the Catholic Church, you know, somebody said celebrate, and they read it celibate, and it got fucked up. Okay, so we got that, right? Okay, we got the deal. Okay, we know. Okay, but you can't just dismiss religion, right, and actually miscaricature religion as not having a self-correcting mechanism. So here's so Yuval, let's read together. Okay, let's go to chapter 4. Errors, the fantasy of infallibility. And what you're saying is that religion is claiming infallibility, and that is bullshit. Okay? Your sentence is, let's to kind of get it, right? Religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism propose that their ideas and rules were established by an infallible superhuman authority and are therefore free from all possibility of error and should never be questioned or changed by fallible humans. That statement is an absolute lie. Okay? Just period. There's no, right? So let's bracket kind of Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. Yuval, let's stay in home court, okay? Let's do the Judaism thing, okay? Why not? All right? So let's take a look at this. So the claim is that fallible humans can't change religion. Okay, so here's a text. Talmudic text, do we agree that the Talmud is a Jewish document, hard to argue with that. Okay, Talmud, 3rd century. Pretty orthodox document as well, right? It's kind of those fundamentalist dogma people. So here's what the document says. Tractate Baba Metzia, 59a, describes Yuval a conversation. And I'm sure you know this text. And if you don't know, I'm actually delighted to share it. But here's the text. The text reads that there's an argument between Eliezer and Joshua, 2 masters. This is at the time of the temple's destruction. So we're moving from temple to Talmud, from prophet to sage. Eliezer adduces an opinion about ritual law, and Joshua and the sages disagree. Eliezer says, let me adduce proof for my position. And he says, if I'm right, let the carob tree be uprooted. The carob tree is uprooted, a miraculous event, and the sages say, we don't accept evidence from carob trees. And then Eliezer's not deterred, and he says, let the stream flow backwards, if I'm right. And the stream flows backwards. And the sages say, we don't accept evidence from streams flowing backwards. Finally, Eliezer says, let the walls of the study hall collapse, if I'm right. And they go to collapse, and then they see they've got to honor Joshua, so they half collapse and half don't, because they're kind of stuck between, the sages. And finally, Eliezer kind of pulls the trump card. He says, God's going to say that I'm right. Whoa. Yatsa bat kol min hashamayim. Right? A voice, a heavenly voice emerges from the heavens. Va'amar, and said, halacha k'Reb Eliezer. The law is Eliezer. The law is as Eliezer. So God, infallible God, has come to establish the position. And the text then reads, it's a gorgeous text. Kam Rabbi Yeshua al Raglav. Joshua stands on his feet. And he says, Lo b'shamayim hi. It's not in heaven. We sages, we incarnate and participate in the field of value with the divine, and we override the God voice. Now, that sounds very, very different from what we just heard from Yuval. That is a classical text. The only way, Yuval, we can read the text that you wrote there is you just weren't telling the truth. Now, you could be unaware of this entire tradition of Judaism and have gotten your information on Judaism from, I don't know, Houston Smith's World Religions. And I like Houston. I had a beautiful talk with him at the end of his life. But I'm sure you didn't, but maybe you did. I don't know. I don't even know what to do with it. Right? And I could go on, but in other words, let's just hold it here. This kind of caricaturing, right, of a position is just not cool, right? I mean, it's just not true. You can't caricature a position, right, then destroy it based on the straw man that you set up. And Yuval, we know that what we need to in an argument is we need to not straw man the other person's position. We need to steel man their position. Let's see religion. What does esoteric religion have to say? What does Talmudic religion have to say? Right? What does the best of Kashmir Shaivism, the root tradition, Abhinavagupta, right, have to say? Right? In Buddhism, of course, right, there are multiple different traditions, and there's not just Theravada and Mahayana and Vajrayana, but as you know, Shingon in the 8th century, Kukai, and there's lots of levels and layers, and we need to look for the best and then see how do we integrate the deepest insights, most profound insights, into creating a new story of value instead of caricaturing and dismissing and lying about what they say. Is that fair, man? Is that okay, Yuval? Okay, man. End introduction. Thanks for hanging. Okay.
Let's go to this first clip, and so you can actually directly respond to something that he's saying in an interview here. So we're going to pull this up. We're going to listen to it. And now you're going to respond directly.
You're really highlighting a question that's really been bugging me almost the last few months, more and more. It's almost a hard question to ask in public, but if any mind has some wisdom to offer in it, maybe it's yours. So I'm going to ask you, what are humans for?
As far as we know, for nothing. I mean, there is no great cosmic drama, some great cosmic plan that we have a role to play in it. And we just need to discover what our role is and then play it to the best of our ability. This has been the story of all religions and ideologies and so forth, but as a scientist, the best I can say, this is not true. There is no universal drama with a role in it for Homo sapiens.
Okay, so that's one clip, and that clip is talking about, is there purpose in the world? So we're going to play that clip. Let's read that other piece, because there's another piece that goes with it.
All right, so from Sapiens, page 391, he writes, as far as we can tell from a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has absolutely no meaning. Humans are the outcome of blind evolutionary processes that operate without goal or purpose. Our actions are not part of some divine cosmic plan, and if planet Earth were to blow up tomorrow morning, the universe would probably keep going about its business as usual. As far as we can tell at this point, human subjectivity would not be missed. Hence, any meaning that people inscribe to their lives is just a delusion.
Is just a delusion. And just to know, in that chapter, and Yuval, you're not using the word delusion here accidentally in Sapiens. You use it 4 other times, right, in that chapter, right, in Sapiens. So you're using it very precisely. You also use the same description. You call it mass delusion in the prologue, right, X14 in Nexus, right? So you use the word delusion and use it in a number of other places. I won't bore people with too much of a bibliography, but the word delusion wasn't a slip of the pen. It was an intentional statement, right? And the statement is that any ascription of meaning or value to life, and by the way, Yuval, let's just be a little rigorous here. So you're only taught, you use the word meaning, but you're pretty clear in Homo Deus, kind of clear as day, that you're using correctly value and meaning as the same intention, right? There's no value or meaning. You say, we don't want to accept that our God, our nation, and our values are mere fictions. We don't want to accept that, right? Which you assume is the truth. Now, again, let's be real clear. Of course, you and I know that there's bad versions of God and distortions. The God you don't believe in doesn't exist. Of course. And of course, I would agree, for example, with an interior scientist like Abraham Cook, who says there is kfira, shehi emunah. There's heresy, which is faith. Of course, when I deny the small God, the caricatured God of a church that's power hungry, right, and is telling fictional stories, I'm doing something righteous. Of course we know that. But you're going further. What you're basically saying is this whole thing, there is no reality to the divine, and there's no reality to value. So you write, we don't want to accept that our God, our nation, our values are mere fictions because, here's the big sentence, because these are the things that give meaning to our lives. We want to believe that our lives have some objective meaning and that our sacrifices matter to something beyond the stories in our head. Yet in truth, the lives of most people have meaning only within the network of the stories they tell one another. So in this sentence, you're quite clear. There's no meaning. Meaning and value are the same thing, and they're mass delusion. Okay, so we just put a bunch of sites together. That's just enough. And the reason, Brother Yuval, I did a bunch of sites, and as you know, I could do 20 more. But the reason we did, just so we're not cherry picking. That's really important. We're not kind of taking something out of context and distorting it. It's real important to understand this is the position, although it's well hidden, but then it gets uncontaminated and achi, brother, like you're clear about it. And I appreciate the honesty, but you're wrong, right? You're making a kind of dogmatic set of statements that simply don't hold. Just to be clear, I am delighted to be wrong, right? Like if you show me, like I completely missed this, and you totally, right, think that there's inherent value in the world, and that actually evil is actually a violation of something, right? And don't tell me, oh, everyone says something's evil and everyone makes up their own evil. We know that. Okay, we got that. Let's get beyond that. We're saying something more serious. We're saying what Bertrand Russell was saying, right? Can we actually say that wanton cruelty is wrong, not just because I don't like it? So if you actually are subscribing to value, and it seems like I've completely misread this, So say it. And I withdraw everything, and dinner's on me, man. Okay? So here we go. So why does this matter so much? And this is like, why does this matter? So one of the things, that you, I, Daniel Schmachtenberger, our brother, Zach Stein, Ken Wilber, and, Nick Bostrom, and Yuval agree on is that existential risk is fucking real. I think Yuval does a fantastic job in Nexus in presenting existential risk. So A, we agree on existential risk. That's one. Two, and here's two. This is where it gets crazy. We even agree on a second thing. We agree that in order to respond to existential risk, and here I want to borrow terms from Harris, from Cultural Materialism, who says there's three ways to kind of respond to reality, right? Which, as we know, and we've talked about many times, are infrastructure. You can change the infrastructure in response, for example, to existential risk. So you figure out how to identify bioweapons in the wastewater. That's a big deal. Or you develop new surveillance structures, right, in order to be able to mitigate potential terrorist threats. People who easily dismiss surveillance as being preposterous don't actually take what Nick Bostrom calls the vulnerability hypothesis seriously. Nick wrote a great article in 2019 where he basically says, when you have a world of X billion people in which you have essentially weaponized drones which are available to rogue non-state actors, for example, you don't need to enrich uranium, which is a state capacity, in order to destroy the world. You have an entire range of drone technologies which enable you to deliver these technologies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And let's not even talk about bioweapons, et cetera, right? Not to have surveillance, well, I don't know. So Bostrom says you got a couple of possibilities. Total surveillance, world government, stop technological advance, right? And he's saying like, what should you do? And it looks like you need some sort of surveillance. Now, Bostrom's weakness is that he wants to do surveillance without any holding of first principles and first values. That's crazy dangerous. But we totally get that surveillance is an issue. We get that existential risk is an issue. And we need to actually engage in infrastructure, but infrastructure, Yuval, we both agree is not enough. We also agree that what Harris calls social structure is not enough, meaning let's get good regulation, right, of ChatGPT-4. And the reason social structure is not enough is A, it doesn't work because there's no one in government or even in universities today that's actually remained, that actually knows and understands the black box of large language modules, because all the people who have even a vague approximate understanding, right, have left and are 9 out of 10 or 99% out of 100 in the private sector. So we don't actually have a governance structure to bind technology, but social structure would be regulation. But we both agree, Yuval, that actually what Harris calls superstructure, which means multiple things, but among them, one could understand it as a new story. That actually a new story changes the game. So we agree on that. So one, existential risk is real. Two, stories change reality. Three, therefore the technology you would deploy now, right, to address the metacrisis, existential risk, would be to tell a new story. We agree on all three of those things. Interesting, but here's where it gets crazy. But what Yuval says is, we're going to make up the story and impose it on society because there are no true stories of value. And what we're saying is, no, there's a new story of value, and we'll talk about it later when we talk about stories that actually can change the game. That's a very big deal. So all existential risk is global challenges. To respond to global challenges, we need global coordination. Two, to get global coordination, we need global coherence. We need some sort of coherence. Three, to get to global coherence, we need resonance with each other. We need global resonance. Four, to get to global resonance, we need some sort of intimacy. I mean, if you ever worked with a couple before, if the couple doesn't have, if they're not intimate, they're not resonant. Then you need shared intimacy. Number four, but here's five, and this is the killer. And you can't get to shared intimacy unless you have a shared field of value. If you don't have a shared field of value that the couple is living in, you can't everything's a hack to create intimacy. It just won't work. So that's true in the personal, and Yuval, that's true in the collective. So the root cause of existential risk is a global intimacy disorder, and the core of that global intimacy disorder is the breakdown in a shared language of value. So actually, the possibility of responding to existential risk would be we need a shared ground of value, which allows us to create global intimacy, which then creates global resonance, which then creates global coherence, which then allows for global coordination, which then allows us to respond to global challenges. And so Yuval's in this paradoxical position. He gets existential risk, but then he literally echoes that the postmodern position, which says value's not real. So that's insane, right? In other words, there's a direct link between existential risk and the breakdown of value. And perhaps just two other things are worth saying. You can't do shared sense making. Common sense is you're sensing the field of value. If we don't have shared value, we can't do sense making, so we have a broken information ecology. You then have to replace, because you don't have a shared story of value, you need to create some other story. So you'll create a success story. And a success story means we run reality based on rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, which has no field of value in it. It's just all rivalrous conflict, which leads us to existential risk. And that generates, as Nassim Taleb points out correctly, or Snowden points out, right? You remember that material, right? Yuval, that generates not complex systems that can be coherent, right? Brazilian rainforest, right? There's a coherent ecosystem, but complicated systems, a Peugeot that breaks down because there's no factory parts, right? And a complicated system means, as you know, brother, when there's no intimacy between the parts because there's no shared value. And here's the last point. In order to actually respond to existential risk, you need to arouse will, moral will. Moral will is aroused in response to value. Value arouses moral will, right? The violation, right, of value arouses moral will. I mean, I remember in the middle of the pandemic, when George Floyd was killed, the COVID pandemic, earlier in this 21st century. And there was an entire community saying, you cannot leave your house.
National lockdown.
Stay at home. That is
Stay-at-home order this morning.
You are a murderer if you leave your house. There was a very real fear, and it was legitimate fear. People were afraid. Then George Floyd was killed. And we all saw it. And that's a complex, tragic story. But whatever happened there was bad shit. Right? Whatever happened was bad shit. Right? In other words, the dude shouldn't have died. And Derek Chauvin shouldn't have had his body on his neck for 9.5 minutes. And that shouldn't have been standard policy for a police department. That doesn't mean we should defund the police. It's a different issue. But shouldn't have happened. So we basically saw a dude getting fucking killed, calling for his mother, right? On a video playing again and again and again. And so that violated the field of value. And fuck COVID, we all poured into the streets the next day, all over America. There was an immediate, spontaneous, authentic, and beautiful, sacred response to seeing the field of value violated. And even though we'd been told by all the national authorities that our lives were at risk and that we could kill other people, didn't matter. Everyone poured into the streets. Why? Because value had been violated. So you arouse will, political will, moral will, in response to a field of value. If you basically say value is not real and meaning is not real, you have no possibility of arousing the will we need, political and moral, right, to respond to existential risk. So what you've done, Yuval, is you've diagnosed existential risk well. We agree on that. You got that story matters. Fantastic. But you say that actually there's no story of value that's real, right, because value is not real. So actually, it's all fiction. So we need a totalitarian imposition of it, either of an Orwellian kind, or, okay, I didn't miss this, brother, or of a B.F. Skinner kind, where you use the internet, right, to turn the world into a Skinner's box, to have invisible levers of control. And when you read a little bit about the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum, right, that digital dictatorship that you talked about in chapter 3 and 4 in 21 Questions actually gets to be pretty real. So first, and Yuval's got to turn to you on this one. So you write, so he says, I'm going to ask you, what are humans for? Now, that's a fucking huge responsibility to respond as far as we know nothing. I mean, let me just get mad for a second. You motherfucker. What you doing? Right? I mean, the greatest, most subtle minds, right, across all traditions, cross-culturally, cross-temporally, right, all thought that there's some intrinsic value to human life, intrinsic meaning to human life, and you're being funny. As far as we know, nothing. What do you mean, as far as we know? Who's we? Right? I mean, the weight of human opinion disagrees with that, and I'm not talking about benighted and distorted dogmatic human opinion. I'm talking about most of the best philosophers through most of history. Okay, there's a very narrow period in history where one group of people, right, made the claim, a la Bertrand Russell in the first quote that we talked about earlier, which said, oh, there's no meaning. And even Russell himself backtracked and said, I can't really hold that position because how could I basically say if there's no meaning and no value that wanton cruelty is wrong? And I can't believe it's just wrong because I don't like it. But you just said, as far as we know, who the fuck's the we? As far as we know, what's the purpose of human beings? What are we made for? What are humans for? The question is, what are humans for? Nothing. Now, everybody laughs.
As far as we know, for nothing. I mean, there is no great cosmic drama.
That was not good laughter, man. Right? That was not like a full, beautiful laughter, emerging from kind of the fullness of the delight of life. This was not the laughter at Plato's Symposium. This was a laughter of fear. It was a laughter that was shrill and pained and desperate and nervous. It was a painful. Did you listen to that laughter? You listen to that clip, man, Yuval? Listen to that. The laughter's that's not good. That's not a good stand-up comic moment. So Yuval goes on and he says, but as a scientist, sorry, hold on one second. Yuval, when did you become a scientist? I mean, just between us. Okay, I thought you were a historian, right? So what's this claiming scientist shit for? Okay, so it sounds like we're doing a little game here that you're claiming the authority of science. So you can get away with that. I'm going to call you on that, but you can't claim to be a scientist. I mean, by the way, I read scientists day and night. One of my closest friends is Howard Bloom, and I know you read the Lucifer Principle carefully, and Howard and I talk every other week and do kind of deep reads of science. So I'm all into science, but I wouldn't call myself a scientist. So I'm getting a little bit, it's not cool. So he says, Yuval says, he says, I mean, there's no great cosmic drama. No great cosmic drama. No cosmic plan that we have a role to play in, and we just need to discover what our role is and then play it to the best of our ability. What a stupid idea, right? Hello, right? This has been the story of all religion ideologies, but I, Yuval Harari, am come to tell you, they're all assholes. Yo, we know there's superficial religion. Right? We got that. But maybe if all religion ideologies had superficial versions and they got lots of it wrong, and I agree with that 1,000%, but actually, when all of reality's singing love songs, maybe love is important. Right? Actually, the fact that everyone thinks that value is real for most of human history, other than a very small group of people, that's a big dismissal. And he says, but as a scientist, right, I can just say this is not true. There's no universal drama with a role in it for Homo sapiens. So it's actually worth your taking a second and doing a little Walt Whitman. Oh me, oh life, of the questions of these recurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish. And Yuval, that's the stuff you're talking about. That's the stories, the fictional stories. Okay? He says, of myself forever reproaching myself, of eyes that vainly crave the light, of the objects mean, of the struggle ever renewed, of the poor results of all, of the plodding and sordid crowds I see around me, of the empty and useless years of the rest, with the rest of me entwined. The question, O me, so sad recurring, what good amid these, O me, O life? So he's asking the same question, Yuval, that you were asked, right? Okay, why are there human beings? And he writes that you are here.
That life exists and identity. That the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse.
And you may contribute a verse. Right? So your point is, Yuval, fuck you, Walt Whitman, which I got the point, right? But Whitman, and here it's worth just stepping back for a second to get to how Yuval gets to the fuck you Walt Whitman, because it's important, because he's half right and half wrong. So let's do movies for a second. Dead Poets Society. You got Robin Williams, you got this group of kids. So you remember the beginning of the movie, he takes them to the pictures of the kids that have died, and he shows them the pictures of the kids, and he says, grass has sprung up already. They're all dead, long gone.
These boys are now fertilizing daffodils.
And then he does the Walt Whitman poem, you can contribute a verse. So Whitman, until the end of his life, was a classical expression of modernity. And here it's worth just taking a minute to throw 3 periods of time in, because it's going to allow us to hold this. So all of premodernity, Yuval, as we know and Aubrey knows, all of premodernity said value's real, but said every ethnocentric group, every nation, every religion said we own value. It's ours, fuck you. And since we own value and we got the only path to infinite goodness, we get to kill you. Bad news. Okay, so we got that. So everyone got value is real, but the exoteric public structures of power hijacked value into an ethnocentric context. Cool. Along comes modernity, and modernity says, fuck that. That's bad. All this local rivalrous conflict between individual religions and kingdoms is not cool, right? There's actually universals that we all share together. Let's be in those. Let's be in a universal kind of ground of value. And then they said, David Hume, but is that value stuff real? So there was the major school of modernity said, David Hume, value is actually not real. And you can read Kant that way as well. You can read Kant both ways. And other people said, value is real, and they tried to locate it in a source. But the major move was, value is not real, but we can't say that out loud because we kind of know there's value, so we're not sure what to do, so we declare value, but we never name a source. So like the Constitution, founding documents of the United States, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Really? This is like value you're putting on the table. You're going to tell us it's self-evident, there's no source? So what the document is doing is it's saying, okay, there's value, we don't no idea where it comes from, but we're taking out a hidden loan from premodernity. We're taking out some social capital from premodernity. We're taking out a loan. We're just going to say value is real. We're just going to declare it. And we're going to call them, and we have a name for it, we call them common sense sacred axioms of value. So whether you think value is real but you don't have a source, or whether you think value is real and there is a source, like Comenius or Adam Smith, or you're the mainstream of modernity, right, which is Hume, value is not real, but everyone pretends like it is. Everyone shares these common sense sacred axioms of value, and that's Whitman. Whitman, through most of his life, is a modern guy, right? Postmodernity hasn't come to call in the loan. Yuval, you're representing very well postmodernity. It's going to call in the loan and say, fuck you, Walt Whitman. Value's not real. Whitman is just saying, hey, I don't know where this is all from. I can't source it, but actually life matters, and life is value, and you're here to contribute a verse. So Walt is modernity. Whitman's modernity. Yuval's responding to Whitman as postmodernity and saying, hey, Whitman, I'm calling in the loan. Okay, that's not cool. Actually, you've got no verse to contribute. And let's get real about it for a second. Just to be clear, as far as we can tell at this point, human subjectivity, read love, read interiority, would not be missed. And any meaning or value, we've already seen meaning or value are the same, that people inscribe to their lives is just a delusion. Yuval, our book club, right? We did a whole book on value, so I'm not going to do value theory now. We'll talk about value a little bit later. But let's just state it for a second. What we're saying is that value and consciousness themselves, just like space and time and motion, they're actually prior to space, time, and motion. They are the ground in which everything arises. That value is not socially contrived, value is discovered. Value's not hard to find, value's impossible to avoid. We live and breathe value. And the simplest way to say it is Bertrand Russell. I can't believe that wanton cruelty, the violation of value, is wrong just because I don't like it. So what Russell is saying is there must be a field of value which that violates. Because actually our entire lives are lived in response to the field of value. Life is how I respond to the field of value. And value itself is, if you want to think about value, value is a structure of reality actually all the way down the evolutionary chain. At the first moment of the explosion of the Big Bang, you have the value of autonomy and the value of communion. And Howard Bloom, right, who you like, Yuval, has written brilliantly in kind of rigorous scientific papers that there's autonomy and communion, two values, and Howard and I have talked about this for 100 hours, all the way down. And Howard and I agree, Yuval, based on a very careful reading of science, that there's meaning and value all the way down, and then there's an evolution of meaning and value, right? And as we go from unconscious to conscious, of course. But you have mathematical value. And mathematical value are the equations of physics that create coherency in cosmos. And coherency means intimacy. And this means there's shared identity. There's an omni-coherent cosmos in which all the pieces in some sense are in this very fine-tuned, gorgeous, larger harmony. There's an intrinsic harmony in the notion of harmony. And music actually exists. Music comes into being with reality. So there's mathematical value. Then there's musical value. Now musical value is, I mean, we were talking yesterday, right? We just take a piece of music like Phantom of the Opera, right? You ever listen to Phantom, man? Yuval? You listen to Phantom like, right? So we respond to musical value because it lives in us, right? And it evokes something in us. It's a big deal. And then we get to molecular values. We've got mathematical value, musical value. Now we've got molecular value. So molecular value means that you've got a proton and a neutron, an electron. They're allured to each other. So it's not mechanics, it's actually allurement. They come together and they create an atom, which is a new configuration of intimacy. Intimacy means shared identity. They create a larger whole. Wholeness is value. Reality moves towards larger wholeness. That new wholeness is called an atom. An atom is a new value. And the value is life. The atom moves towards new depth, new interiority. Richard Feynman, a legitimate figure in physics, talks about an interiority that goes all the way down. Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, Whitehead talks about apprehension and interiority and aliveness that goes all the way down. But even if you don't want to accept that, you clearly have this allured cosmos that's creating a new value, right, called an atom. And then an atom, atoms come together. And what are atoms? Atoms are not mechanics. You spend exactly 4 sentences or something like that at the beginning of Sapiens, right, talking about the kind of the world that's called the inanimate world, right? And you kind of just dismiss it, and you say the story begins with a cognitive revolution. To be precise, you spend, I don't know, six sentences. No, you spend one, like kind of 4 sentences, right? You say, about 300,000 years after their appearance, matter and energy started to coalesce into complex structures called atoms, which then combined into molecules. Right? The story of atoms, molecules, and their interactions is called chemistry. Okay? That's it. We're done. Whoa, 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 hello? Hello? We go from quarks, 3 quarks, only 3 quarks are together. Without 3 quarks, they dissipate, right? And then we finally get to 380,000 years after the Big Bang, and then you've got this new movement of allurement that creates a larger whole called an atom, and then that allurement, the 4 forces, right? The strong and the weak nuclear, the electromagnetic, the gravitational, this precise balance between allurement and autonomy, which is what love is, which actually drives the eros value of reality, then moves, right, these atoms, which are all not mechanical, Those are configurations of intimacy. That's what an atom scientifically quite literally is. They form molecules, right? Which is a new configuration, new value structure. Then macromolecules. Then you intensify the value proposition of intimacy in macromolecules, and then they awaken, Stuart Kaufman's description, the evolutionary biologists, they awaken as single-celled organisms, and then they run into crises, single-celled organisms. They can't breathe oxygen, it's not going well, so they don't roll over and die. The force of life moves to deeper intimacy, and we gradually get to multicellular reality, which is the road to life to you and me. So from mathematical value to musical value, to molecular value, we then get to moral value. Right? In other words, value, eros, love, is intrinsic to cosmos, and the story of cosmos is the evolution of value. And it was Whitehead, right, my dear friend Yuval, right, who talks about reality. And Whitehead was a pretty good mathematician, a pretty good thinker, pretty good scientist. He says reality has an appetite for value. Reality's hungry for value. Reality moves towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. Right? Like, wow. So that's you're dismissing all of that. Right? And saying that's just nonsense with a kind of, and I apologize for this, but we're getting serious now, with a slightly arrogant wave of your hand. Right? You're kind of adducing scientific authority for something over which science has no authority, as good science knows well. Science doesn't have the authority to say there's no meaning in life. Right? And you don't have the authority to say that the world is just matter, because matter itself is constituted by what matters. We go from mathematical value to musical value, right, to molecular value, to moral value, and in the end we get to mystical value. And you in a number of places dismiss the term mysticism. Let's call it interior sciences, which is, mysticism says one thing, or the interior sciences say one thing. I participate in the field of value, and the field of value is real. It's not a dogmatic old religion, which you and I both know needs to be renewed. Mysticism is saying at its core, the interior sciences, that we participate in this field of value, therefore we can participate in evolving the field of value. Okay, so Yuval, let's just talk about a couple of more things. You talk about human life has, here's the quote again, absolutely no meaning, right? And human subjectivity, if it wasn't here, meaning love, etc., wouldn't be missed by reality. Any meaning that people inscribe to their life is just a delusion. So I want to just talk a little bit about the way you're using science. So in both of these citations and in numerous other citations, is a little complicated here, right? Because what you're saying is, you're saying this claim is from a purely scientific viewpoint, and then in the other clip you say as a scientist. So you're making this intellectual gerrymandering move where you kind of hijack a term to use it in a particular way, but actually it's an inappropriate usage, right? Science doesn't speak about in any way, right, whether there's meaning in the world. The science is talking about empirical analysis, right, of measurable activities. That's what science is doing. Not only are you using science to claim that meaning is not real and that value is not real and that it doesn't exist and that any meaning to life is self-delusion, so you're claiming that science is making a statement about meaning, when actually what science is doing classically is eye of the senses, which is classical empirical measurement. Modern science does measurement. It measures motion, and measurement is and it measures everything. And measurement's the massive breakthrough that generates the Industrial Revolution and generates everything, right? It's mathematics and measurement that put us on the moon. We understand that, but of course what happens is the immeasurable gets left behind. Right? Intelligence is measurable, consciousness is not, value is not. And I want to use the word, Yuval, not consciousness, because it's too easy to obfuscate there. Let's use value. Right? Value is immeasurable. It's priceless. It's a priceless moment. It's immeasurable. It's not reducible. It's not commodifiable. So science can't dismiss that. So hijacking science for your position is big time gerrymandering. It's just not true. And we both know it's not true. So that's one. In chapter 14, Sapiens. You ready for this, man? Okay. This is a big one. Modern science has no dogma. So you caricature religion as being purely dogmatic. You dismiss the interior sciences. And then you say modern science, no dogma. It's not true at all. Modern science is actually filled with dogma. And I actually jotted a few down here. So here we go. I'm going to go through a few dogmas of modern science, okay? So one, nature is mechanical. That is a dogma of modern science. Two, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same, right? That's a dogma, meaning there's no chi, there's no eros, there's no value moving through cosmos. There's not an eros that animates the self-organizing universe. Let's ignore dark matter, right? Dogma, total amount of matter and energies, always the same. Three, the laws of nature are fixed. Four, matter's unconscious. Five, nature is purposeless. Six, all biological inheritance is material. Seven, all memories are stored as material traces. Eight, minds are confined to brains. 9, I know it's getting boring, right? Psychic phenomena are illusory. All of parapsychology just made up. And David Ray Griffin, the Whiteheadian scholar, wrote a great volume on this. And he kind of went through a rigorous, careful, empirical analysis, right, of psychic phenomena. William James, as you know, in Harvard, and Sedgwick, right, in England, Henry and Edith, right, began the psychical societies. There's more empirical research with carefully validated methodologies, checking against hoaxes, right, taking place in the psychical world than virtually any other field. And number 10, mechanistic medicine is the only model that works. All 10 of those are dogmas of modern science. Every single fucking one. And we know that. There's an enormous amount of well-documented, well-researched, right, articles that appear in whatever journals they can get published in, and an incredible body of material. And, one of the people who's done great work on this, right, who makes this list is Sheldrake, in a book called Science Set Free, right, scientist from Cambridge, student of Bohm. But there's lots of other material on this, as you know, and yet all of the 10 dogmas, which I just listed, every single one of them stands as a dogma and actually is enshrined in the depth of modern science. So modern science is actually telling a story. And it's a fictional story, or at least it's a not proven story. Minimally, it's a partially fictional story that it's claiming as fact, which you completely ignore, and you say with kind of a straight face, modern science has no dogma. That is just not true.
I hope you guys are enjoying this discussion about the necessity of value and meaning in our lives. And if you're interested to see the foundation of Rebbe Gafni's work on the first principles and first values, check out this book, First Principles and First Values, authored by a collaborative effort called David J. Temple, available on Amazon. And you'll really find the deeper substructure of where all of this information is coming from, and actually learn why first principles and first values not only exist, but are necessary to guide us through the challenges of the existential risk that we face. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the show.
All right, let's look. Obs, ready to go, brother? Okay, so let's look at another topic here. Okay, Yuval, we're doing another topic here. Let's talk about human rights, because human rights is a way to see how this value piece plays. So let's look at a clip. Yuval, this is you talking about human rights, By the way, you had a great red shirt on. You're looking good. Okay, so here we go, brother. Okay? Human rights.
Many, maybe most legal systems are based on this idea, this belief in human rights. But human rights are just like heaven and like God. It's just a fictional story that we've invented and spread around. It may be a very nice story. It may be a very attractive story. We want to believe it. But it's just a story. It's not a reality. It is not a biological reality. Just as jellyfish and woodpeckers and ostriches have no rights, Homo sapiens have no rights also. Take a human, cut him open, look inside, you find their blood, and you find the heart and lungs and kidneys, but you don't find there any rights. The only place you find rights is in the fictional stories that humans have invented and spread around. And the same thing is also true in the political field. States and nations are also, like human rights and like God and like heaven, they too are just stories. A mountain is a reality. You can see it, you can touch it, you can even smell it. But Israel or the United States, they are just stories, very powerful stories, stories we might want to believe very much, but still they are just stories.
So let's just see what you're saying here. I just want to kind of look at what Yuval just said. So Yuval basically says human rights are, this belief in human rights, are a fictional story just like heaven and God. Meaning not just heaven and God are fictional stories, which he's identifying as premodern, but of course heaven and God are not premodern. Premodernity hijacked heaven and God and its public structures, right, in ways that were often corrupt. But the intuition of heaven and the intuition of the divine, right, those aren't fictions, but he assumes they are. And then he says, just like that's a fiction, okay, so are human rights. Human rights is, for Yuval, just I'm quoting, and this is the clip we just saw, human rights is, right, quote, just a fictional story that we've invented. So human rights don't express anything real in the universe. It's a story, it's a nice story, it's an attractive story, I'm quoting, but it's not real, because the only thing that's real, he says, is biological reality. Now, a couple of things. First, Yuval's ignoring the fact that all of biological reality is coded with value, right? It's all coded with a movement towards life, towards more and more uniqueness, more and more diversity, more and more depth, more and more possibility. But I'm not going to talk about biology now. Let's just look for a second about human rights. He's saying human rights don't exist. They're just made up because the only place you find rights is in the fictional stories, right? Yuval, am I getting this right? I'm quoting you, that humans have invented and spread around. Now here's the thing. Of course you're going to say that, brother, because rights are rooted in value. And this is really important. Where do rights come from? So if you look at legal theory today, right, legal theory has a hard time in postmodern legal theory. There's this enormous confusion about where to ground the law, because law was always rooted in value. But the second you deconstruct the field of value, you basically destroy law. I'm here with my friend, M. I don't have permission to use his name, but he's involved. He's an actor, and he's playing on Law and Order. And why do people watch Law and Order? They watch Law and Order because it's speaking to something. It's speaking to this bunch of men and women who are heroic. They're standing for value. They're not standing for social constructions. They're not standing for contrivances. They're not standing for fictions. They're actually these heroic beings who put their lives on the line, standing for law and order. But by law and order, they mean not a totalitarian law and order, not imposed by a fictional story, but they're standing for what George Orwell called the fundamental decency of value. right, that actually is inherent in reality. Now, I just want to be clear for a second, brother, just so you don't think I'm kind of taking a quote out of context. Oh, God, you said, human rights were fictional just in a passing comment. You didn't mean it. I mean, damn, you mean it. And you say this all over the place. So chapter 2, Sapiens, right? You kind of say pretty clearly that no real distinction between Gaddafi's Libya, right, Ops? Right, this is chapter 2, Sapiens. No distinction between Gaddafi's Libya and UN's classical visions of universal human rights. No distinction. And actually, you make quite clear that human rights are, how do you say it there? And in general, all stories of value are, but for now, we're going to focus on human rights are, what do you say, figments of our imagination, social constructs, and fictions. Huh. Now, it's not just chapter 2, Sapiens, and I commend you for consistency. So let's go back to the quote we used earlier. Where's Sapiens? Here. 391 Sapiens. You basically say, after you say that all meaning in life is just a delusion, you're very kind of equal opportunity, accuser of delusion, meaning everyone's deluded. So, for example, you say quite clearly that, as far as we can tell, right, any meaning that people ascribe to life is a delusion. Then you go on to say, so not just the medieval people, they weren't the only ones that were deluded, but the modern humanists, right, meaning the people who hold universal human rights, they're just as deluded. You go on to say 391, bottom paragraph, last 2 lines, the scientist who says her life is meaningful because she increases the store of human knowledge, deluded. The soldier, right, who declares that his life is meaningful because he fights to defend his homeland, and I might argue, and let's say he's defending his homeland, right, in a way that has integrity, right? It's not that he's lost in a xenophobic nationalist myth which is deluded. He's actually defending his homeland which is being unjustly attacked. Delusion, because there's no meaning. And the entrepreneur who finds meaning in building a new company, right? They're all, your quote, delusional. And they're just as delusional as their medieval counterparts, right? Who found meaning in reading scripture, going on a crusade, or building a new cathedral. Now, let's not get into the caricature of the medieval period, which deserves caricature, but not only caricature. There was also depth. There was also interior sciences, more complex, right? But your position is universal human rights, right? Sapiens 2, Sapiens 391, total delusion. And then, let's get to Nexus, new book, okay? So in Nexus, you kind of take this all the way home. Now, it's interesting, my friend. In Nexus, you stay away from a kind of direct dismissal of value and meaning. You change the language. I don't know exactly why, but you hide it a little bit. Instead, in one place early in the book, prologue, chapter 1, 2, you talk about ideals, or ideas are fictions. But then, more often than not in the book, for example, 275, 276, 278, that's the key chapter about this stuff. Chapter 8, fallible, the network is often wrong. There, you basically say that, again, human rights are totally made up, but you do it now in a new way, and this is worth talking about. So you're talking about artificial intelligence. And now here, Obs, what Yuval is talking about, the value alignment problem in artificial intelligence. And we could talk a lot about the threat of artificial intelligence. I think Yuval got this exactly right. And I think, Yuval, you did a brilliant job, really brilliant, of unpacking the threat of artificial intelligence and kind of cutting through the kind of starry-eyed techno-optimism that's not actually taking the threat seriously. I thought that was, fucking brilliant. And the book was worthwhile just for that. If it didn't have this other insidious, chilling, life has no meaning, everything's a delusion problem, which actually destroys people in their interiors. But in terms of the analysis of artificial intelligence, Yuval blew it away. So then, he gets into trouble again. He says, okay, so maybe we could solve the artificial intelligence problem. And again, the problem of artificial intelligence is, in a word, is that artificial intelligence actually is not like a printing press. It's not just a technology that human beings deploy. It's a technology that actually makes decisions and innovates independently. That's critical to understand. And so as artificial intelligence gets more powerful, it has the capacity to make decisions and innovate in a way that could actually lead to the destruction of humanity. That's a very, very real and live option. It's a big deal. You know, I mean, the example that Jaron Lanier deploys in his book, what's his book called? 10 Arguments for, what's it called, Yuval? 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Account. So Jaron deploys this argument, and Yuval echoes this argument. It's deployed by quite a number of people. They use Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, and that's a place, and other people have used Brazil in multiple books, and Yuval uses the same examples, which basically say in Myanmar, you had this amplification of this Buddhist xenophobic hatred of Muslims, which caused massacres, right, that were completely unwarranted. Now, how did this amplification happen? Why did the algorithm of Facebook in Myanmar make a decision to keep playing the most vicious and vitriolic recordings of Buddhist monks who are all about essentially massacring the subhuman Muslims? There actually were other legitimate and important voices in Myanmar that got drowned out. So who decided that? So it wasn't somebody sitting at Google. Where's Google? In Cupertino, wherever it is in California, somewhere in Silicon Valley. They didn't make that decision. The algorithm made that decision, right? Artificial intelligence made that decision. That's a big deal, and Jaron Lanier points that out, and it's completely right? Why? Because the algorithm said, my job is to optimize engagement. Now, engagement's just another euphemism for addiction, meaning I want long-term repeating customers. I want to fixate the attention of the end user on the screen. I don't want them to leave. Why? Because the profit model of Google is to keep you on screen as long as possible, then to collect what's called the digital exhaust or the digital breadcrumbs from your actions online. But those are not, people think, oh my God, they're tracking what pornography I'm watching. That's not what they're tracking, although they might be tracking that also. But that's not the core. The core is, so let's say you hover over the mouse for X amount of time, so it tracks that. The patterns of your typing, the seconds between, movement 1 and movement 2 on the web. So what's actually happening is Google's tracking the micro patterns, of your movements on the web, feeding them into machine intelligence, And it's the machine intelligence that discloses the micro patterns. Those micro patterns allow Google, through artificial intelligence, to develop predictive analysis about how you will respond in particular situations. So let's say we make an advertisement where we have a particular sequence. You got a cat, and the cat's white, and the cat meows in a particular way, and then it's followed by a particular jingle for 2 seconds, and then it has fonts that are blue, And then the cat comes back, and then we're selling you socks, whatever it is. So what Google does is they do split tests of that sequence. Let's have a brown cat, not a black cat. Let's have the cat meow for another half a second. Let's have a different font, Let's change the amount of time that the little musical clip goes on. So what Google does is it split tests the sequence to judge, to evaluate, and collect information about how you respond, meaning which sequence gets you to respond. But Google split tests that all the time, meaning it's not somebody at Google who's sitting doing the split test. Artificial intelligence is running the split test all the time, Millions, tens of millions of time, all the time. And once we figure out how you react, we put you into, and this is another euphemism, we put you into what we call a peer group. Now we know that we have predictive analysis about how you will respond right, to this particular sequence to get you to do this particular action. Now, we could get you to vote when you weren't going to vote. So we could go to a particular district, identify, right, there's a whole bunch of voters of a particular ilk, but only X amount go out to vote. But if we increase those who go out to vote by X percent, we swing an election. Facebook did that experiment, right, in 2010. And Alex Penton from the MIT Media Lab says, yo, go Facebook. And there was kind of a running joke in Facebook for a long time that elections are a joke. And everyone knew that elections were a joke. And of course, the person who ran Obama's campaign in 2008 and in 2012 was Eric Schmidt from Google. And it was based on micro-targeting, right, based on artificial intelligence. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. Artificial intelligence is extremely powerful. It can split test, right? It can decide how to micro-target an end user. It can decide which videos of which Buddhist monk to play in Myanmar. And in Myanmar, where Facebook was the instrument of communication, by constantly deciding to play again and again the most vicious and vitriolic and racist and anti-Muslim material, right, that caused directly the deaths, the brutal deaths of thousands of people. Facebook was directly implicated. Now, let's just check this for a second. Why did the algorithm do it? Because the algorithm was optimizing for engagement. And what causes engagement? Because the algorithm's agenda was keep people engaged for as long as possible, collect the most data you can about them. That then generates a more accurate predictive algorithm. And the algorithm is the product that Google, Facebook, social media, TikTok are selling. And then the algorithm figures something out. Hate keeps people fixated more than good news, more than tolerance, more than humility, more than openness, more than fraternity, more than love, right? There's an immediate limbic hijacking that takes place through hatred. And so the algorithm decides independently to play hatred. So that's just one minor example of an algorithm, and this was a pretty primitive algorithm, X amount of years ago, right? As artificial intelligence gets more and more powerful, right, it continues to innovate and make decisions independently. So that is part of the, just to give you a sense of the threat of artificial intelligence. So the question is, why don't we just upload ethics or value, right, to artificial intelligence? So Nick Bostrom, who's a key thinker on existential risk, thinks about this issue. And he talks about, in his book Superintelligence, the value alignment problem. Now, what's the value alignment problem? And Yuval, you restate this, brother, I think quite well. But here's where we run into just a horror. So first part of the value alignment problem is, how do you upload value into large language modules, for example? How do you upload value? It's a technology problem. It's a data science programming problem. How do we upload value? That's problem one. But here's the bigger problem, right? There's nothing that's called value. And Yuval, you pick up on this theme in Bostrom, right? And you basically go to town on this. And let me just kind of give it to you, brother, right? If I can kind of give you a direct self-quote, right? You say, tech, right, we're page 277, you say, tech executives and engineers who rush to develop AI are making a huge mistake if they think there's a way to tell AI, right, a rational way, what its ultimate goal should be, right? Now, you're using the word ultimate goal, and you're quite consistent in the book. By ultimate goal, what you mean is an ultimate goal that doesn't serve another ultimate goal. That's what you say directly, meaning value, meaning inherent value. But what you're saying, Yuval, is we can't do that because there's no value. And if there's no value, then there's no possible goal you could upload into AI because all value is just made up. Number one, A, you're just assuming value is not real. That's A. But B, you're assuming that you would upload one ultimate goal. That's the way you frame it. Which ultimate goal should you upload? So the entire field, right, of thinking, right, both moral, philosophical, and all the interior sciences that talk about value being real, no one would say you upload one value or one ultimate goal. You would, of course, upload a range of ultimate goals, a range of values. Whenever you take one value, right, and you decontextualize it from the larger field of value, and you make it the ultimate goal or the absolute, you always generate evil. So the whole point is you've got a field of value. In that field of value, there are multiple expressions of value, and those all need to work together. So your caricature of uploading one ultimate goal or one value goes against all of the philosophical traditions. It's nonsense. But the bigger problem is that Yuval says there's no ultimate goal because there's no value, so there's nothing to upload. And it's worth seeing, right, how Yuval does this. He talks about, Napoleon. And he says, well, what could Napoleon's goals have been? Well, he says 5 possible goals. 1, make France dominating power in Europe. 2, create a new multi-ethnic empire ruled by Napoleon's family, kind of goal 2. Goal 3, everlasting glory for himself. Goal 4, eternal redemption of his soul. Goal 5, spread the universal ideals of the French Revolution, freedom, equality, human rights. And Yuval says, page 276, all 5 of those are just fictional and made up. None of them are real. Meaning there's no difference for Yuval between the value of universal human rights and the value of Napoleon trying to achieve everlasting glory. Right? He's quite clear. He says, right, why should Napoleon care about mythical France any more than about his mythical soul or about human rights? So he says all 5 of these ultimate goals or values, right, Yuval? All 5 of these ultimate goals or values, they're the same. There's no difference between them. They are purely made up. And of course, he has to say that. There's no other move. Human rights have to emerge from inherent value. And if there's no inherent value, you have no inherent rights. And notice, once there's no inherent rights, we're moving again, right, Yuval, towards totalitarianism. If there's no inherent human rights, then totalitarianism is the order of the day. Huh. Now we get, Obs, to the core of the thing. And this is kind of our third kind of set of issues, and this is around story. Now, Yuval, we both understand this is your big deal, right? What Yuval's basically going to say, let's look at a clip, right, for a second, and see Obs, how does Yuval treat story? And basically what he's going to say is that the organizing stories of reality are fiction. Now, how that works is a very big deal. So let's watch this clip. Okay, here we go.
Well, the superpower is our ability to invent and believe fictional stories, fairy tales, which doesn't sound like much of a superpower, but actually this is what enables us to cooperate flexibly in very, very large numbers. Millions of people cooperate because they all believe in the same story. Chimpanzees can cooperate like 50 chimpanzees or 100 chimpanzees. You can never convince 1 million chimpanzees to come together to build a cathedral or to fight a war or to build a spaceship to the moon by convincing them in some story, in some mythology. But this is the way that we cooperate. And again, it's not just religious mythologies. It's also the economic system. Corporations, as I said before, they are just a fictional entity. They exist only in our imagination. No other animal on the planet is even aware that corporations exist. Similarly, money is probably the most successful story ever told. And money, again, it's just a story we invented. It doesn't have any objective value. like, I don't know, bananas and coconuts and things like that.
Yeah.
But we have the greatest storytellers in the world, which are not the people who win the Nobel Prize in literature. It's the people who win the Nobel Prize in economics. And they tell us a story, and it's basically the only story everybody believes. And it's worked so successfully that I take this worthless piece of paper and go to the supermarket to a stranger I never met before in my life, and I give them this worthless piece of paper, and they give me bananas that I can actually eat. And this is something that chimps can't do. And this is why we control the world and not the chimpanzees. And if you think about, I don't know, a place like United States today, when people are having so much trouble agreeing on anything, but they still agree on money. It's kind of maybe the last line of communication, that they agree on the prices, they agree on money. And the amazing thing about it, it's only in our head. It doesn't come from the laws of physics or biology. It's just the stories that people invented.
So what's Yuval saying, Obbs? He's saying, okay, let's just take a look at it. Our superpowers, our ability to invent and believe fictional stories, fairy tales, and these stories are, he says, ridiculous and nonsense, but we believe them anyways. Now, in the clip we just saw, he doesn't use the words ridiculous and nonsense. He describes them a little differently. But Yuval is writing, we talked about it before, children's books. So the second section of this book, called Unstoppable Us, that's the name of the series, it's how humans took over the world. And the second section of this book is about stories. And basically, Yuval says in the second section of this book the same thing that he says in this quote, which is that humans have this strange possibility, this strange quirk, that they organize based on stories, even though the stories are totally fictional. Now, let's be really clear, and in this book as well, kind of volume 2 of Unstoppable Us, there's an entire section on stories as well. So this is a major theme. This is not a minor theme. And what Yuval's doing is he's teaching this to children. I say, I want to get that. So what Yuval's saying is, I'm going to look in my child's eye, and I'm going to tell them there's no stories of value that are true, which is exactly what he does. In this book, he sets up as an example of stories of value, right? This oil that we need in order to make someone the king of France, and clearly you don't need this magical oil to make someone the king of France. So he says, this ridiculous story, this nonsense story, those are his direct words. He says to the kids, he says, grown-ups, look what grown-ups are doing. This is exactly the words he uses. This is not me. What grown-ups are doing is they're believing these utterly ridiculous stories, these stories that are nonsense, they're ridiculous, but they believe them, and it's those stories that organize the world. Now, again, let's go slow. What Yuval will do is he'll say, oh, money is a made-up story. That's true. Corporations are a fictional story. That's true. McDonald's is a fictional story. That's true. So the core point that there are fictional stories in the world is, of course, true. But that doesn't mean that all the organizing stories of reality are fictional. So to look at a child and say, unstoppable us, oh my God, grown-ups make up stories of value. The organizing stories of reality are just not true. They're fictional. And it's good to believe them because, so why is it good to believe them? So I want to kind of go back here and really understand what Yuval's saying. But maybe even before we go there, I want to just go back to one piece of his quote. He says, chimpanzees can cooperate, 50 chimpanzees or 100 chimpanzees, but you can never convince 1 million chimpanzees to come together and build a cathedral, fight a war, or build a spaceship to the moon by convincing them of some story, meaning some fictional story, some mythology. But that's the way humans cooperate. So let's go slow here. Let's try and understand what's actually happening here. Yuval, Nexus, right? And just we kind of get that we're not making this up. So in Nexus, in the prologue, right? Yuval, remember the prologue, right? So Yuval's real clear, right? For tens of thousands of years, sapiens built and maintained large networks by inventing and spreading fictions, fantasies, and mass delusions about everything. But not just about gods, but about value. That's the point, right? In other words, large networks, I'm quoting Yuval, bind people together and create order by relying on fictions and fantasies. And he says, and don't think that the fact that they work means that they're true. No, fictions and fantasies, for example, he says, Nazism and Stalinism, right? Bind people together, right? Fictions and fantasies. He cites the Catholic Church. So another example Yuval uses is 1.4 billion Catholics in the world. 1.4 billion Catholics, they get together based on complete fiction, fantasy, mass delusion. Or take a look at Catholicism. You've got the virgin birth, and you've got virginity postpartum, and you've got immaculate conception. And then you have all the dogmas of the Catholic Church, which he says, well, completely fictional. And 1.4 billion Catholics believe in this. Or he talks about communism, 1.4 billion communists in the world, right? Or people under communism. Obviously, this huge set of fictions, right? Completely fictional story, right? So people, he says, are bound together by fictions, right? Nazism and Stalinism, another example, people bound together by fictions. The Bible, another example. So he says, you know, the Bible says that human beings emerge, early humans emerge out of Mesopotamia. But we know that they emerged out of the African savanna. So obviously the Bible's not true. And the Bible says when there's pestilence, you should pray. But we now use penicillin. So he caricatures, right, the Catholic Church, the Bible on the one hand, right? On the other hand, communism, those three. That's one set of caricatures. Another one's Nazism and Stalinism. We'll come to that. And he says, these are obviously all fictional stories because human beings cohere based on fictions. Now, this is at the core to the whole thing. So here's what Yuval's saying. And he unpacks this in Sapiens. He unpacks it a little bit in 21 Questions, another book, you know, in Nexus, and in, you know, multiple conversations, interviews. So how do sapiens become dominant in the world? And again, it's really important that these are children's books. This is what he's telling children. Right? Value's not real. Stories of value are not real. You think they are. Grown-ups are crazy. And so children grow up with that sense. Now, here's the story he tells the children in this book, Unstoppable Us. So, and it's a children's version of what he says in all the rest of the books. So something like as follows. Human beings naturally organize based on knowing each other directly. That's the original early organization of human beings. That's called the Dunbar number. So there's small bands of up to about 150. They create trust between each other because they know each other. They're connected to each other. They've met at the water cooler, right, of the ancient tribe. He says, when you look at human history, you've got humans for quite a while. You know, is it 500,000 years? Is it 1 million years? It's unclear. 2 million years. But at some point, this emergence of the human beings, right, expresses itself in several different genus of Homo, several different families of humanity. One of them is called Neanderthals. Now, the Neanderthals are ultimately overwhelmed. They disappear by Homo sapiens. So why did Homo sapiens triumph and not Neanderthals? Now, you remember when we were growing up, we were, you know, when your parents called someone a Neanderthal, right, it wasn't a compliment. We had this early vision in anthropology of Neanderthals being Neanderthals, meaning being somehow primitive, somehow backward, somehow regressed. We now know that's not true. We now know that there was, you know, art and kind of great subtlety and sophistication in the Neanderthals. So what Yuval says is, what was the difference between the Neanderthals and living at the exact same time the other Homo genus of sapiens? He says the difference was that sapiens had language. Why did that matter? So he says the simple reason, and he's now citing anthropology, the simple reason would be, they could talk to each other and organize a better hunt. So language had a survival advantage. But he says correctly, well, that's insufficient. No, language had a much more powerful capacity, the ability to tell a story. Without telling a story, you're only going to organize up to the Dunbar number, say 150 people, because you got to know all those people personally. If you just figure out how many people do you know, most people know personally or can interact personally with not more than 150 people. So that was true in the ancient world. So you'll get up to 150. So you'll get a band of 150 Neanderthals. But if you can tell a story through language, and this is Yuval's point, people will meet in the story. Sapiens no longer had to know each other personally in order to cooperate, page 19 of Nexus. They could now just meet in the story. And the same story can be familiar, again, page 19, to billions of individuals. A story can thereby serve like a central connector with an unlimited number of outlets into which an unlimited number of people can plug. For example, the 1.4 billion members of the Catholic Church are connected by the Bible and other key Christian stories. The 1.4 billion citizens of China are connected by the stories of communist ideology, etc. Now, notice what he's saying. He's actually giving this a mechanical image, not by mistake. He says it's like a connector, a central connector, has an unlimited number of outlets into which an unlimited number of people can plug. So what he's saying here is that because everyone can meet in the story, even though the story's completely fictional, because there's no value. So it can't be a story about value. It can't be a shared story of value because there is no value. So story is a mechanical blip in cosmos, which is this connector. Everyone meets in the story. So they say, we don't really know each other, but it's like we know each other. So we create this kind of pseudo-intimacy, not real intimacy, this kind of pseudo-intimacy, and we can go beyond the Dunbar number. So now you're going to have 150 Neanderthals, but you're going to have 1,000 sapiens because they all know the same story, or 2,000 sapiens because they all know the same story, and 2,000 sapiens are going to outfight 150 Neanderthals, but they'll also out-innovate. And then there'll be 10,000 sapiens. And then, if there's a particular hunger in a particular season, they'll go to their cousin sapiens someplace else who are all part of the same band of 10,000 people, right? Because they share the same story. And the story's like a mechanical connector. Everyone plugs into the story, so they don't need to know each other directly. Okay, that's part one. Now, part two, he says, and then this mechanical blip of a story, this connector that allows everyone to plug in and therefore exceed the Dunbar number. I'm going to have 10,000 people fighting and 10,000 people innovating. He says, if you change the fictional story, you can then reorganize society. So if you've got a crisis, just tell a new story. It's a fictional story because you can organize people and get them to cooperate and to cohere based on fictional stories. Now, here's the deal. Yuval, you're wrong, right? It's actually a distortion which is very profound, and we need to point to this, brother, okay? So, let's look at this. Is it true that 1.4 billion Catholics cohere around a fictional story, right? These idiots, right, are cohering around this fictional story. Or those Jewish people are cohering around this Bible that's fictional, but the story is this kind of connector. It's this mechanical connector, this blip of cosmos that causes people to cooperate and cohere. No. Yes, the story might be partly fictional, but it's also a story of value that people recognize. So Catholicism, yes, one of the most corrupt institutions in history, and a great religion, right? Meaning it's holding some deep shared truth. So when we talk about the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew, right? That's an entire story of value. And people read about virtue and they read about love and they read about care and they read about community and they say, that's a story of value. And then when people talk about Christ, right? This notion of this Christos, this divine love that loves you infinitely, that loves you so insanely much that is willing to die for you. Right? that people recognize, they feel in themselves, right, this structure of love that they participate in. Because reality actually at its very core is eros. Right? It's animated by eros. All the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. Reality is actually a love story. But not as a fiction. Actually, from subatomic particles that become atoms, and atoms that become molecules, and molecules that become macromolecules, and macromolecules that become cells, all the way up through the biological world into the human world, there's this force of allurement that brings people together. So reality is not just the mechanical evolution of simplicity to complexity. Reality is the progressive deepening of intimacies. And intimacy means shared identity, right? Subatomic particles, shared identity, they create an atom. A couple gets together, shared identity. Nations get together in a league because they need shared identity. But intimacy is not just shared identity. It's shared identity plus mutuality of recognition, mutuality of pathos, they feel each other, mutuality of value, there's a shared value that creates mutuality of purpose. Now we call that the intimacy equation of CosmoErotic humanism, which is this story of value that weaves together the deepest validated insights of the traditional period, the modern period, and postmodernism. And core to this integration is we take the best validated insights from all the periods, we weave them together into a larger whole. So one of the things that we're bringing together into the story is a deep understanding of science. And once we understand science, and once we understand anthropology and sociology, we realize, there's this thing called an intimacy equation, which governs a human being, right? I want to be intimate with all the split off parts of myself. I want to have shared identity between all my split off parts. That's our friend Dick Schwartz, who does internal family systems. Let me be intimate with my split off parts. And then I want to have shared identity. All the split off parts are part of me. I want to have mutuality of recognition. I want my different split off parts, my controller, my protector, my wounded child, I want them to talk to each other. I want my split off parts, my different selves or sub-personalities to feel each other, mutuality of pathos, of feeling. Right? I want them to be part of a shared story of value, mutuality of value. And then I need them to cohere, to actually work together towards a shared purpose, mutuality of purpose. But that applies to a self and internal family systems and at a human level. It applies to subatomic particles, right, in the world of quote-unquote matter. It applies to the molecular world. It applies between nations. It applies in a couple. In order to create a story of value that binds people, you can't do it just based on a fiction. Right? A story comes together because it's not just a fictional story, it's a mythic story, and mythic stories express value. So let's look at it again. You got 1.4 billion Catholics. So why are they cohered? Not just because they got fooled by a fictional story. They're together because they actually experience the value of Christos, right, of feeling loved by reality. When they think about the virgin birth, they're thinking about the value of innocence and the value of virginity, right? But virginity not as a technical, structural idea, but of the sense of purity, right? The sense of vision, the sense of purpose, the sense of being so held, right, by reality that it can actually rest in that place. Now, are there corruptions of the dogma? Of course there are. But the point is, the same thing with the Bible. Right? The Bible's not simply an archaeological mistake claiming, as Yuval says, that, people emerge out of Mesopotamia when it's really the African savannah. The Bible itself doesn't understand itself that way. Many of the internal sources say that the entire, book of Genesis is in many ways mythic. Interior sources in the tradition say that. That's not the point. The point is there's a set of core value structures that people experience. So how do you create, now this is deep and beautiful, why does people meeting in a story create coherence? Why does it create cooperation? not because it's a connector in which people plug in. It's not mechanical. That's how Yuval describes it. It's a mechanical fluke of a mechanical cosmos, a materialist cosmos. No, because people recognize each other in the experience of value. So here's an example. Let's go back. Let's use movies for a second. I don't know, was this late 20th century, early 21st century? Movie called Pretty Woman. Right, Hobbs, remember that? So Richard Gere, who was it? Julia Roberts. She's a courtesan. He hires her. They fall in love. They're going to the opera or a symphony, and he's watching it, and it's so stunningly beautiful, and his whole heart is crying. He looks over, and he sees these tears running down her face, and they completely find each other. Right? He falls madly in love with her with him, because they're feeling the same value. That's so deep. We cohere as a couple. We create intimacy as a couple. We create intimacy as a nation. We create intimacy as a religion. We create intimacy as a larger communion because we participate in a shared story of value. Now, yes, there are fictional parts of organizing stories, but people don't cohere around communism because of Maoist dogma. Actually, at the very core of communism is a gorgeous vision. There's a reason why all the Jews in New York in the 1930s were communists, because they were drawn to this vision in communism, which seemed to be about egalitarianism and brotherhood and sisterhood and a vision of a better society and the workers, throwing off their chains. And they felt that the prophetic vision of value was fulfilled in communism. Now, that turned out not to be true. But people cohered around communism, not because it was a fictional story utterly made up, and there was some technical, mechanical blip in cosmos that allowed coherence to happen. They cohered because it was a story of value. That's a very big deal. So here's where we agree, Yuval. We agree that there's a metacrisis, existential risk. That's real. We agree that stories are enormously important, that they're organizing dimensions of reality. We agree that by changing the story, we can change the vector of history. It's a big deal. So we agree on three big things. But what you're saying is that actually there are no stories of value. Why? Because all stories of value are fictional. So therefore the story of value has to be made up, which is why you talk about, right, if you know you're making up the story, you can lie about it. But that gets us into real deep trouble, my friend. That means either we're creating an invisible totalitarianism of the kind described by B.F. Skinner, the famous Harvard psychologist who reigns in Harvard for 6 decades, who, as you know, writes a novel called Walden 2, which is essentially about putting the entire world in a Skinner's box. And we both know what a Skinner's box was. It was called an operant conditioning chamber by Skinner. Skinner said, value's not real. Remember, he wrote a book in 1971 called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, where he said we got to leave behind the autonomous man who has freedom and dignity. We need to actually only pay attention to the part of the human being that is, this is page 200, by the way, in Beyond Freedom and Dignity, page 199 to 201. Look it up. We have to only pay attention to the part of the human being that is observable and manipulable. Direct quote. Why? Because he says value's not real. He says value's just a positive reinforcer. And he says love's not real in Walden 2. Love's just a positive reinforcer. It's a pure social construction. So Skinner says, Skinner gets existential risk. If you read all of his writings, he gets existential risk like you and I do, brother. And he says, okay, let's put the whole world in a Skinner's box in which you control rats and pigeons through invisible levers of control. So that's one way to interpret your work, Yuval, right? You're saying story up-levels reality, right? But stories are all fiction, and we can lie about the story in order to cohere society. Well, that's Skinnerian totalitarianism. That's an invisible, benign totalitarianism, which becomes not so benign. It becomes a digital dictatorship very fast, and it becomes a Chinese social credit score system very fast, which allows us to be utterly controlled, and you can create a Chinese social credit system invisibly, or you go Orwellian, right? You go 1984, which is another way you can create a Chinese social credit score system. And a social credit score system means, it means essentially that you're scored for everything you do. You're scored for your political opinions. You're scored for, do you raise your children in accordance with party dogma? You're scored for, the nature of your employment and how you show up. You're scored for everything. And the more developed technology becomes, the more we can access your inner feelings, because we have effective computing that actually gets access to what you think and feel. So we score you based on, are you fulfilling the party's vision? And if your credit score goes down, you can't get a job. You can't get accepted to university. If you're friends with someone whose credit score goes down, you might not be able to get a job. Your son might not be able to get a job. And as we begin to create a system that either in an Orwellian overt way controls the story and controls you, because there are no real stories of value, it's all controlled either through a 1984 Orwellian vision of Big Brother that controls you and controls the fictional story through doublespeak, which we talked about earlier, or you've got a benign totalitarianism, which is turning all of reality into a Skinner's box. And the MIT Media Lab, for example, under Alex Pentland, actually adopts Skinnerian thinking quite clearly in 23 distinct ways, and actually designs the web as a Skinner's box. So that, Yuval's the only options that you have, because you say stories of value aren't real. We're saying something completely different. And this is the whole difference. And this is where Yuval goes wrong in a very deep way. This dogmatic dismissal of value, and we'll come back and talk about value theory more deeply, but this dismissal of stories of value is so intensely problematic. Because actually, A, value is real, number one. And two, value is not real in a frozen way. That was part of the critique of value theory. Oh, how can you have eternal value when everything's always evolving? No, you actually have eternal value in the sense that you have not eternity as in everlasting time, eternity as in beneath time. Meaning there's an inherent field of value out of which everything emerges, and then that inherent field of value evolves. Now, let me give an example, because this is going to get very, very, very real. This changes everything. So let's say we realize that reality is eros. And by eros, we mean the animating energy, the animating force of value, which animates all of reality, right? From the subatomic to the molecular to the cellular, all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. Now, what is eros? What do we mean by eros? So we have an eros equation, which we've spent 10 years developing. So eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact, and ever greater wholeness. That's eros. And that applies at the subatomic level, at the biological level, at all the levels of biology, into the human world, and at all the levels of unfolding evolution in the human world. Now, we have a crisis, a metacrisis. Yuval says, let's impose a fictional story of value, because there are no stories of value. He tells kids, hey, there are no stories of value. All value is made up. Any ideal, any nobility, any love, any loyalty, any integrity, all human rights, it's all made up. It's all quote unquote nonsense or ridiculous, the stories that grown-ups tell. That's actually not true. Actually, and it's so deep, reality is eros. Eros is the love, how did Dante say it, that moves the sun and other stars? How did Tagore say it? Love is not mere human sentiment, it's the heart of existence itself. All of reality is animated by love. Reality is not merely a fact, reality is a story. And reality is not an ordinary story, reality is a love story, because eros is a core value of cosmos. Now, Yuval, value theory. But that value of cosmos, which is eros, is not eternal in the sense of being unchanging. It's evolving. And yes, value theory got some things really right. And value theory said, well, if you freeze frame value in a kind of naturalistic fallacy, you say, this is what value is, that it's eternal and unchanging and preordained, that can't be right. And value theory got that right. That was a good critique of the old versions of value theory. No. Value is inherent. Value is backed by the universe, and value is evolving. Because evolution itself is quite clearly a value of cosmos. Right? Values are inherent to cosmos. Cosmos values mystery, and cosmos values gnosis. Right? Cosmos values uniqueness and the evolution of uniqueness. Cosmos values transformation. There's a set of first principles and first values that animate a universal grammar of value as a context for our diversity. But that grammar of value, and brother, we're staying, and now we've gotten super serious, Yuval. Apologies, but you know, we've been playing, but it's crazy serious and crazy beautiful, right? In other words, the eternal Tao, the word Tao in Taoism, Tao is the field of value. But it's the field of value out of which the 10,000 things arise. So the eternal Tao is not the unchanging Tao. It's the ground of value. It's the field of value in which everything arises. So the eternal Tao is the evolving Tao. So love, eros, the field of value is the structure of cosmos. Whitehead was right. Cosmos reaches for value, and the central value is life. We're reaching for life. We're reaching for intimacy. And intimacy is that we can feel each other. So for example, if someone suffers, we can feel them suffering. We have to turn towards them. We have to move for healing. We have to move for wholeness. And that's one of the great realizations of Buddhism. Life is suffering. And now we need to move to, in the 10th oxhorting picture in Buddhism, we return to the marketplace to transform suffering. So there's an eternal Tao, but the eternal Tao is the evolving Tao. The eternal value is evolving value, right? Obs, now we've revisioned value theory in a fundamental way. Now what we're saying is, now it gets really beautiful. So we've got a metacrisis, existential risk. We need to address the metacrisis. We need to address existential risk. So Yuval, how do we address it? We don't address it through a fictional story that's imposed by Walden II, turning the world into a Skinner's box in a benign totalitarianism, in which human beings are rats and pigeons that we move through invisible levers of control. No, that's not a good move. We don't impose a Chinese social credit score or Orwellian totalitarianism. No, we actually tell a new story. We agree on that, but we tell a new story of value, right? Because eros is the value of cosmos. Eros is love. It's a love story. Reality is a love story. Story coheres reality, right? That's what you and I agree about. Right? A shared story coheres reality. So what we do is we tell a better story. We tell a story which includes more. We tell a story in which there's not just an in-group killing an out-group. There's always been in-groups killing out-groups. Our friend Howard Bloom points that out. But that doesn't mean there's no value, right? That means that, one, there's always an in-group. And in every in-group, there's an understanding that we should love each other. That's a universal. We all get that. Everyone in the in-group should love each other. But the boundary's been in the wrong place, right? We've made too narrow of a boundary, too narrow amount of people or kinds of people are in the in-group. We need to expand the boundary until there is no boundary. That's no boundary consciousness. There is no boundary. Everyone's in the in-group. There is no out-group. No one's outside the circle. There's no extras on the set, right? Everyone's part of the story, and then animals are part of the story, right? And any being that can suffer becomes part of the story because intimacy is a value of cosmos. So we begin to see it, Obs, right? So let's put it together. Reality is not merely a fact. Reality is a story. It's a story of value. When you have a crisis, every crisis is an evolutionary driver, right? Yuval, our crisis is a birth. What does it birth? A new story. See, because every crisis is a crisis of intimacy. Reality is the progressive deepening of intimacies. So a crisis is a crisis of intimacy. It's a crisis of relationship. It's a crisis of coherence. So if you have a crisis of coherence, what do? You tell a new story. But a new story that allows for, that generates a higher coherence, not through imposing an Orwellian or Skinnerian totalitarianism, through fictional stories that are mechanical tricks that allow human beings to coordinate based on mass delusion, as you describe it. No, it's actually a deeper story of value. We go from ethnocentric communion, ethnocentric circles of intimacy, to world-centric circles of intimacy in which every human being is included. Then we go to cosmocentric circles of intimacy in which all the animals and all beings that suffer in any way are included. So we actually participate in the evolution of love, which is the evolution of the love story. Now, Obs, this is critical. Let's go back and see if we can bring this together. Okay? Yuval, you ready? Okay. So what stands against totalitarianism? What stands against the totalitarian impulse to impose suffering, either through crushing the human spirit, as in Orwell's 1984, or numbing, deadening the human spirit through Skinner's Walden 2. You read Skinner's Walden 2, it's this banal, deadened, remember the movie Yuval Stepford Wives? It's kind of like the Stepford Wives, right? It's this, right? This world of upgraded algorithms and downgraded human beings. So what stands against that kind of imposed fictional story? A true story. What's the true story? The love story. And reality is not merely a fact. Reality is a story. Reality is not an ordinary story. Reality, Aubrey, right, we understand as a love story, but it's not an ordinary love story. It's an evolutionary love story, right? It's eros that animates, and eros is eros value, right, Yuval? Eros itself is value, and value is filled with eros, right? When we talk about eros being the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness, wholeness is the right relation between parts. That's a new wholeness, which means a new value. Let's go back to 1984, okay, Ab? So what stands against totalitarianism? The love story. Winston and Julia love each other madly. And we know the love story is true. When we experience the love story, when we experience eros, arousal, desire, attraction, goodness, agape, however you tell that story, when you experience that love moving through us, we know that it's true. We know it in our bodies, right? Remember, Yuval, the text from the book of Job, through my body I vision God. I have a first-person direct access, what I would call anthro-ontological, anthro-human being, ontology for real. We have direct access to value being real. That's what a love story tells us. So the big brother figure, right, the kind of totalitarian society, which is called in Orwell's 1984 the ministry of love, has to crush the love story, because the love story is the knowing that value is real. Okay, so Obs, let's put it together. The love story is what tells you that value is real. Do you remember Shakespeare? Lady Macbeth has died. Lady Macbeth with Macbeth was the love story. The second she dies, he says, life is a poor player that struts and frets its hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. Remember, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace, day after day to the last syllable of recorded time. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sounds and furies signifying nothing. In other words, when Macbeth loses his connection to Lady Macbeth, it was the love story that gave him access to the knowing that value is real. Let's fast forward to the South in the 20th century. Faulkner, the existentialist, and Yuval, right? Faulkner, the existentialist, is real close to you. You're kind of repeating classical existential dogma. Faulkner writes a book called The Sound and the Fury, right? Emerging out of Shakespeare, right? A tale told by an idiot. Macbeth, Act 4. Faulkner calls his book The Sound and the Fury, and he's talking about the fictive story of nobility that was the South. And the hero is Quentin Compson. And when his vision of his sister Cattie's love story is shattered, he can't bear it anymore, because there's a fictive version of the love story that involves this kind of purity, chastity, virginity that Cattie doesn't want to live in. And Cattie winds up being humiliated, rejected. He's devastated by the love story that he understood to be the only right love story being shattered. And Quentin Compson commits suicide. That's The Sound and the Fury. Orwell, Winston and Julia, Big Brother, the fictional story makers, the fictional storytellers stand against the love story. Skinner, right, Yuval? Skinner, Walden too. Right? Whenever there's a love story that's powerful and independent, you got to leave Walden 2, and that's the story of Barbara in Walden 2 gets Roger to leave, right? And the way Skinner, right, describes the story, Fraser, who's the Skinner character in Walden 2, is that Barbara's sense of the love story is what takes her away from Walden 2. But what we're saying is, no. Stories of value are real, and stories of value are always a love story or a story of eros. The reason a story of value becomes a large organizing story is not because there's a mechanical pseudo-intimacy, and this is the key to the whole thing. It's because we're creating a genuine intimacy. We meet each other just like Julia Roberts meets Richard Gere in this experience of shared intimacy, shared interiority, and we trust each other because there's a shared field of value. Obs, let's look at this last clip of Yuval. And this clip is about why people don't trust each other.
I want us to move to like the personal side of this.
Yeah.
And I wondered from your side, I've seen you speaking about a broad range of topics. When you look at this in your personal life, everyone out there can, have these lofty conversations. But I think there's an overlap to how we speak to each other as people and how we engage with our family members, our co-workers, etc. How do we develop those networks to maintain the trust? Like, where does the trust get built, and where do you find it breaks in those information systems that are just between people before we go to nations and before we go to states? Is there an overlap between these?
Trust depends a lot on how we understand reality. What is our theory of human nature, basically? And one of the things that is happening now in the world, which is very dangerous, is the spread of a very, very cynical view of human nature and human society, which basically says that all reality is just power. And the question to ask is not, is it true, but whose privileges are being served by what is being said?
Right.
If you think like that, if you start with the assumption any human interaction is just a power struggle, if you're now saying something to me, I need to find out, okay, whose interests are being served by it. I immediately discount the fact that maybe you just think it's true. You're not making a power play on me. And the thing is that this cynical view of the world is first of all, again, it's dangerous because it erodes trust in all institutions. And then one institution after the other, you don't believe anybody, and you think you're liberating yourself, you're actually handing society on a plate to a dictator. Because once people lose trust in all the institutions, again, the only thing that works is a dictatorship in this situation, which doesn't need trust. It works on terror. Very different mechanism. So it's a dangerous view, and it's also wrong. Most human beings in most institutions, most journalists, scientists, politicians, whatever, even if they pursue power and even if they have this kind, sometimes they manipulate people, that's also true. That's not the only thing about them. And you start with a more charitable and generous view of other people. When they said something, even if I disagree with, it's not necessarily they're trying to manipulate me.
Right.
Maybe they really believe it, and maybe they have some good reasons to believe it.
Yuval, how do people do this reframing? Because what you're suggesting is a deeply radical idea, which is just to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
Give people the benefit of the doubt.
It shouldn't be radical. It should be...
maybe be a bit compassionate with yourself and figuring out like what makes you tick. But that is a very daunting prospect, just reframing that maybe the world is more good than bad. Like you telling me that, I'm like, I don't know about it. I'm already like freezing up, but that's my ego, because you're actually right. There's more good out there than bad.
I mean, we wouldn't survive a day if it wasn't for that. I mean, again, this radical doubt that everybody is just out to manipulate me and to gain power. I mean, if this was true, I would not be alive. I mean, every day I'm alive because so many people are doing different things for me. From the people who manage the sewage system, to the people who collect the garbage, to the doctors who develop medications and then take care of me. If I go around the world feeling I can't trust anybody, you're just fooling yourself. You're trusting people all the time.
So here's the deal, Yuval. We can't trust each other unless we share value. That's the whole point, right? In other words, if we don't share value, then I've got to know what you're going to do in every situation, in every story, right, in every instance, and I've got to know you for many, many years, and there's very few people we can know that way. So we can't create a universal grammar of value, but we have a world in which all our challenges are global, in which planes can fly in low over Manhattan and take out the World Trade Center, right? In which a virus doesn't respect national boundaries, right? All of our challenges, from artificial intelligence to climate change to dead zones in the oceans, right, et cetera, go down all 15. They're all completely global. So if we can't solve the global intimacy disorder, right, Obs, then we can't create coherence. We can't respond to existential risk because we can't trust each other. But Yuval, we can't trust each other unless there's a shared field of value, because it's only a shared field of value that creates trust. And the reason these organizing stories cohere human beings is not just because, oh, fictional stories, mechanical blip in cosmos, oh, we got a connector cable, lots of people plug in, as you describe it in chapter 2 of Nexus. No, because people are experiencing, recognizing each other in the intimacy of the shared field of value. So when we tell, and this is everything, Obs, as you know, that we're doing together, when we tell a new story, it's a new story of value which expands the circle of intimacy. It expands the circle of care. It expands the circle of love. And we begin to include more. We include more science. Because science, Yuval, is a way of becoming more intimate with cosmos. We include consciousness. We include deeper senses of inherent value. We include, right, the depth structures of knowing of all of the great traditions. We include all the validated insights of premodernity and of modernity and all the schools of wisdom in modernity and postmodernity's critical insights. All of them have a place at the table. They're all true but partial. They're all expressing some dimension of the field of value. We begin to tell a new story. And let's close it here, okay? The only way to challenge anti-value, the only way to challenge that which causes suffering, the only way to challenge what you describe as the horror of Stalinism and Nazism is to recognize that there's a field of value. That's exactly what Bertrand Russell says when he says, I can't believe that, wow, the only thing wrong with wanton cruelty is I don't like it. No, we need to restore the field of value, but not the old field of value. We need to actually tell a new story of value. We need to move beyond the broken forms of premodernity, modernity, and postmodernity, weave their validated insights into a new story of value, in which we hold the depth of our certainties and the depth of our uncertainties. We hold our gnosis and we hold the mystery. We hold epistemic humility. We embrace our ignorance, even as we embrace not the knowing that it is true, but the knowing that I am true. Okay. Yuval, we did a big dive here, man. Right? Read it. I would love your thoughts. I did a big Yuval reading job. Okay? I want to end, brother, with this short point. I want to go to the end of Nexus, okay? At the very end of Nexus, Yuval writes an epilogue, and he says the following, And Yuval, you kind of go poetic here, and you pick up the sword of the noble crusade, in the best sense. And let me read it to you. It's on page, where are we? Page 403. As far as we know, you write, as far as we know today, apes, rats, and other organic animals of planet Earth may be the only conscious entities in the entire universe. Now, first off, you made that up. Okay, right? In other words, the claim that the only conscious entities, meaning awake conscious entities, are apes, rats, and other organic animals, is the claim that there is no consciousness in cosmos itself. The cosmos is denuded of value. Okay, so let's just start there. But then you say, and you get very beautiful here, brother, you say, we have now created a non-conscious but very powerful alien intelligence. You're talking about artificial intelligence. You're reading AI as alien intelligence, and you do it beautifully. Okay, next sentence, and this is the key. If we mishandle it, AI might extinguish not only the human dominion on Earth, but the light of consciousness itself, turning the universe into the realm of utter darkness. It's our responsibility to prevent this. So brother, just my heart to your heart. When you make the claim that the universe is denuded of value, that any story of value that coheres people is a mass delusion and a fantasy and purely fictional, that value itself is but a contrivance, a fiction, a figment of our imagination, then you actually undermine our ability to respond to existential risk, and indeed risk either the death of humanity, extinction of some form or another, or the death of our humanity, right? A digital totalitarianism. You talk a lot, Yuval, about these fictional stories being imaginal, right? Figments of our imagination. You talk about imagination a lot. Remember Feuerbach, my friend? He said, God's a figment of our imagination. Feuerbach was right. God is a figment of our imagination. But our imagination is a figment of God. Yes, the God you don't believe in doesn't exist. Not the caricatured God. Right? Let's think about, in the last sentence, let's see if we can put it all together. What if we thought about God as the field of value itself? What if we thought about divinity as not just the infinite, but the intimate? The divine is the infinite intimate that lives in us, as us, and through us. Huh.